All right. Happy Friday, everyone. And I hope you have had a fantastic week and are already getting ready for the weekend. We are back here with another episode of Learning Tech Talks, where we are continuing to explore the landscape of learning tech while cutting through the fluff and getting your questions answered. So today I'm joined by Ryan Austin, who is making the magic happen with Synapse. See, I took that from your LinkedIn, by the way. And we're going to be talking about streamlining the intake process for L&D, things like that. And by the way, Ryan Austin, for some reason, that music is very fitting. I get like this WWE feel whenever I say your name. So hope for those of you who are just complete redirect there. But anyway, for those of you who are just joining us live, go ahead, give us a thumbs up, share the post, tag in somebody who would benefit from the conversation while we're getting started. And while you're at it, if you would, comment in and let us know where you're joining from. Ryan, where are you in the world today?
Yeah, I'm calling from Toronto, Ontario.
Okay,
So
you're up.
north in Canada.
You're up north, eh? You don't say that though. I don't think in our conversations I've ever heard you say "a." Do you say it?
It depends which province you're from.
Okay.
You'll get that from a lot of different people if you go into different provinces for sure.
Okay. Well, my aunt is she's from BC, and she says "a" all the time. So I don't know if maybe that's a province where they say it. And not in Toronto though. So I'm in Waukesha as always. Real quick before we get into the question of the week, real quick reminder. So last Sunday and Tuesday, I posted something very mysterious about something that's coming and asking for help. I asked. You all delivered for sure. So I'm actually going to have to be closing the application at the end of today. So there's still time if you'd like to be part of it. That's about all I can say. If you want more details, look back at my post from this week. So that has nothing to do with today's episode, but I wanted to at least cut that off so people weren't surprised when the app closed. All right. Question of the day has nothing to do with what we'll be talking about, Ryan, and I'm looking forward to hearing your answer. Those of you who are watching, you can play along, add your answers in the comments. But what is something that people often assume about you that is not true?
Ooh. I would say that I'm an account executive or a salesperson at Synapse.
Okay. So in what scenario does this pop up? Like you're at the pub or something like that and people go, "Oh, you're an AE," or like when you contact people?
Well, generally at work because I still spend some time with our sales team, and I'll do some calls with clients or prospective clients and whatnot. So they make the assumption that I'm an account executive or a learning solutions consultant, as we call it, and they're talking to the CEO.
Do you just let people go with it?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so you don't stop them.
Nah, I don't have a title. I always tell my team that I'm whatever you need me to be.
Okay. Well, actually, what's funny about that answer is it's you'll see there's actually a relation to what mine is going to be. Okay, so mine is people assume all the time I go by Chris. All the time, right? They're like, "Oh, hey, Chris," and I actually go by Christopher. I don't go by Chris. And what's interesting, so probably maybe a similar reason for you is I don't like to correct people publicly. I'm getting a little better at it, but I don't like to because there's no way when you go by the long version of your name to not sound like a pompous jerk when you correct people, right? You're the short version. Hey, Christopher. You're like, I'm Chris. You're cool. Hey, Chris. Oh, it's Christopher. You're uptight, right? You're hoity-toity, and I'm not at all. So I'm like, well, it's fine. I'll just let it go. But anyway, sounds similar with the CEO. You don't want to be like, I'm not the account executive. I'm actually the CEO.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it again, the title doesn't really matter, but at the same time, it's always fun when they talk about, so how long have you been in sales and things like that.
You're like, well, it's kind of an irrelevant question, but okay. Awesome. All right. Well, so today we're talking about, the title was operationalizing the learning process. I think when we first met and we're talking about this, as we got into what Synapse did, we really talked about kind of and what we'll dig into, right? That front end and how do you actually streamline all this stuff to make sure you're working on the right things. But rather than me try and articulate it, when people say, what is Synapse? How do you answer that question? Like, how do you describe it?
Yeah, so we actually tag ourselves as one of two things. Learning design system is what a lot of
Okay.
some of the analysts have started to call us, which is interesting. But internally, we'll talk to people as learning and development productivity software,
Okay.
and really explain how we help them do three things: manage the intake process, so being able to manage requests from their business partners in a consistent way, so it's not ad hoc, it's organized, it scales.
Okay.
Um, Project prioritization and capacity planning, being able to understand supply and demand and articulate to stakeholders when they just have too much work, and they either need resources or they need to make trade-offs. And then content design with stakeholders and SMEs and whoever. And um, we've kind of brought the three things together into one platform so you can actually track all the data and whatnot.
Okay. It's interesting that the category that some have assigned it is, what was the first one you said? Like design.
A learning design system. For some reason, learning, you know, analysts, professionals, they love
They
the
love to put it in a box.
yeah. So, you know, you have learning management systems, you have learning content management systems, and now you have a learning design system.
See, but to me, when I hear learning design system, and maybe this is just me, right? My head goes to the actual authoring, right? Creation
Mhm.
tools, the authoring tools. And that's not what Synapse is, correct?
Yeah, I mean, we have one output, which is as part of the design side of our platform, the ability to collaborate, storyboard, prototype. A lot of our clients will look at these prototypes and be like, hey, for what this need is, this particular need, micro learning or, you know, some sort of rapid deliverable, they'll say this is good enough. So we do have the ability for
Okay.
them to export it in SCORM, upload it to their LMS, but it's flexible enough so that if they're using their authoring tools, they can do that as well.
Okay. So the authoring component or the piece that you technically could author is more of it's designed to be this storyboarding kind of like collaboration piece. But then if you end up saying like, hey, this is really ultimately what we needed, you could export that out and use that as the actual content itself. So I guess
Yep,
technically, see, this is where these categories get really confusing, right? Because
it's true.
there's not very many tools that are like, we do this one thing and we fit very nicely into this one box. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk the problem statement first, because we'll unpack, I think, a little bit more what this is. But I was excited when we talked about it because I do think this is a big opportunity area. But I'm curious on your end, when you started this thing, what were you seeing in the space that you said, you know what, this is a problem, and I think we can do better.
Yeah, well, it stemmed from me experiencing this problem. So I headed up learning and development for a company called World Trade Group
Okay.
years ago, and in working with subject matter experts, trying to capture knowledge, design into programs, understanding needs of customers, being able to prioritize. It was just a mess. Like we were using email at the time for requests, you know, Excel spreadsheets for project planning and whatnot. I mean, this was probably 8 years ago or so.
Okay.
Um, we were meeting in person with the SMEs, you know, so it was kind of all over the place. And to make matters worse, we were um, getting our content accredited by IASET for continuing education. So we need to follow this vigorous process to like show that we're meeting all these standards. And it was just so much time wasted. It was really inefficient. And I'm like, there has to be a better way. So talk to IASET. I'm like, who has software to help with this? Or like, oh, we don't know anybody who has that. Let us know if you know. So then we started talking to different people in the industry and different learning teams, and they had the problem too. So I said,
Same
you know
problem.
what, this is a problem I think we can solve. And given my technology background from previous companies, I said, let's do it. And that's kind of how this idea spun up.
Okay.
took a lot longer than we thought. Who would have known that making software flexible enough to replace email and paper and Excel spreadsheets.
So there was a reason why somebody hadn't done it quite yet, and one of the reasons may have been it wasn't quite as easy to spin up as you thought.
Yeah, well, and it's very expensive. I mean, we've invested millions of dollars into this technology already, and we're fortunate to have very strong institutional investors behind us. But
Okay.
I think, a while back, the closest probably that your audience would be familiar with would be a company called Designer's Edge.
Okay, I
From
remember it.
Yeah, but technology just wasn't where it is today,
Yeah,
wasn't as collaborative. So I feel like the idea has always been there, but technology hasn't necessarily been that flexible.
yeah.
And so the time is more fit for this than ever, in my opinion, to actually solve this front end problem for learning development
Well,
teams.
I'm sure COVID had to have boosted this as well, then to some degree, to actually have this need to say, we may have been cobbling together, right? Like you said, we kind of had our way of doing it and it was working sort of. But now that kind of blew things up. Did that have an impact? I guess I'm assuming.
Yeah, for sure. Do you know, it's interesting and a little off topic to what we're talking about today, but I was fortunate to be invited to the CHRO series, and Josh Burson was presenting. There was only 8 of us on in this virtual workshop, and he summarized it very well. When the pandemic happened, people reacted like, "Oh no, there's no more instructional-led training. We got
Yeah.
to go buy 100 Zoom licenses, or uh, WebEx licenses or whatnot." So companies that offered virtual webinar software or whatnot kind of blew up, right? They
Yep.
saw acceleration. And then the next phase was more transformative, where it was oh wow, now we need to train people on working from home, and now we
Yep.
have to train people how to work safely back at work. And with the very important Black Lives Matter movement, now we need to train people on inclusion and diversity. So companies like LinkedIn Learning, Coursera, Udemy, companies who pre-package and offer content off the
Yep.
shelf, they had acceleration. And we're still in that
They're
phase,
getting
in my
candy.
opinion, right? We're still at the back end of that phase. The next phase is the longer standing phase, digital transformation. Like,
Yep.
the reality is that not everybody's going back to work. A lot of companies, especially tech companies, said we're never going back to work. Um, you can't just make requests ad hoc by walking by the training person in the hallway anymore.
Yeah.
And collaboration is extremely important. And of course, you have tools like Slack and Microsoft Teams, which are great, but they're not solving the same
They weren't really
collaborative
designed. Well,
problems.
they weren't
Yeah,
really designed for. I feel like L&D is a really unique field, and it's misunderstood. I think by a lot of different people, and there are some. I'm not a big fan of saying like, oh well, we're unique, but there are some really unique things that are in L&D that, like you said, you can't just pick up some off the shelf tool and say, well, this will work. I mean, again, could you? Maybe, but it's going to be the same as, say, doing okay, well, we have an Excel spreadsheet and we use all this, right? You're kind of duct tape, you're MacGyvering a solution versus having something that actually optimizes it.
you got it. So like, that's one of our advantages, is that we're purpose built for L&D. So what's happening now with digital transformation, people are starting to realize like, hey, we can't do things how we're doing it before. We need to be working more agile, doing agile learning, and more importantly, agile learning development. And some people know how to do that. Some people have been doing it. Some people are learning and talking about it, and still trying to figure out how does that really work. And what's interesting, and I think this is great, we're starting to see people adopt these workflow technologies or
Yeah,
workload technologies like Asana or Jira, which is meant for engineering software
I know,
teams.
right? You're seeing a lot of these things blow up.
Yeah,
Trello,
Monday.com. And
Smartsheet, things like that.
they
Yep.
work well, but they don't cover the full L&D process, because these are tools that are meant for all projects across the organization. And
Yes.
like you said, L&D has very specific things to deal with, like how do we standardize adult learning principles so that we have quality learning and
Right.
teach people how to do these things, but in a more digital,
Yep.
streamlined way. And so by Synapse being purpose built to solve these problems, we can invest money and R&D into these things so
Into
that
a very specific thing.
exactly right.
Yep. Well, so there's two things that you hit on, and I think the second one's going to be a question that I think we'll be able to unpack. So Brian, don't worry, I'm about to hit this one, but I think Josh's point is spot on. I think what's interesting is a lot of people talk about COVID as though it started something, and I look at it more as it accelerated it, right? Most of this stuff, we've been saying this for a long time that this is coming. And I think, yes, we've now boosted it. And you did see that trend, right? Everybody went into firefighting mode, at least the folks who weren't already there. I like to say we were COVID proof, but the folks that were there, they went through this panic phase. Then it was this content phase. And I do think you're right. This digital transformation is now the sustainability, because I don't think everybody took that as seriously at first, because I think the thought was, well, COVID hit, a couple weeks are going to go by and we're going to go back.
Yeah.
And that has not been the case for anybody who has been living through 2020. In fact, it seems to continue just to keep going. So with that one, though, a question that Brian asked, and actually I can say, having led L&D teams, I've had to tackle this with teams, is that a lot of times there's pushback when we talk about, hey, let's create a standard process for L&D, or let's try and streamline what this is. A lot of times L&D draws creative folks, people who are thinking creatively. It requires a lot of creativity. And sometimes process can feel very stifling to say, well, when we try and operationalize this, we lose the creativity. I personally don't see it doing that, but I think it's the way you apply it. So how do you deal with people when they're running into this and they're like, well, we get it, but at the same time, we don't want to over-index, and now we just become a manufacturing plant where we're just intake, we do a thing, we kick it out the other side, and it's just moving through.
Yeah, so I think a little bit differently. Operationalizing means, in my opinion, like how do you streamline some of these administrative tasks that come with these roles, or even in some cases automate them, so that learning professionals are actually being advisors and consultants to the business. Like, without naming the company, there's this company that we're talking to. There's two L&D managers and a VP of L&D, and the L&D managers are they're writing content in Captivate, for example, and trying to make it look pretty. And we're talking to them, and we're like, dude, the learners really care how pretty it looks. Like, is the content relevant to them? Is it solving a business problem for them? They're like, for this one, yes. And we're like, so think about when we're learning, we're going to Google, we're Googling things, we're reading articles, we're watching short videos. When you have a problem and you search for information to solve that problem, do you really care what it looks like? And she was like, no. But then they have some other content that they're forcing people into because it's compliance driven, and for that you got to get creative. Like, how do we make the information sticky? Because if I'm forcing you and you have no alignment to wanting to learn it, there's nothing in it for you, but your company's telling you need to do it because they need to tick the compliance box, etc. Well, then for sure, like, might as well make it fun, or try and come up with a strategy or solution so that it does become
mitigate the
sticky.
pain a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So I look at this to answer the question, operate to operate to streamline the processes and to automate them, but not take away the creativity side of things. So, we were careful in designing our software to be able to do that, so that if some people really need things rapidly, they have more templated options that they could do, but giving the ability to be flexible enough. So if you want to use Articulate, you want to use Captivate, you want to use Venn, or any of these other softwares, you can still do that and upload it as a deliverable. But I think thinking through the process and how you remove bottlenecks, how you remove administrative tasks so that your people who are one of your best assets are teaching other people
Yeah.
about learning strategy and how this can all work. That's where they're best served their time, not writing content, but teaching other people to write content and mentoring them to do it
Yeah.
and whatnot.
Well, it's about focusing on the higher order things. And I think one of the things you hit on there that because I've run into that too, right? Where it's well, I feel like this is stifling my ability to be creative, right? Even you start talking about templates, you run into the same thing. And I think I always look at things as like there's the iron triangle, which is what you're getting at, right? It's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
how fast do we need to do it? Quality, like what is the problem we're trying to solve, and where do we want to index within the iron triangle of what we can do and what's most important? But I think what you're talking about with optimizing the process is that it's a similar pushback you hear to automation, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
people are, well, I don't, automation takes away from what I do. And I would say, no, it doesn't. So, to the creativity piece, optimizing your L&D process doesn't necessarily remove any of the creativity from it. It actually can open the door to do more of it because you're not spending your time on these mundane tasks, the inefficiency you described in the beginning, right? We got to fill out this Excel sheet and then we got to put it on SharePoint and run over. That's time wasted that you could be investing in being more creative, improving the UX. Like, what are you doing to do that kind of stuff? That's my take on it.
Mm-hmm. And there's different roles too on the team, right? So somebody who
True.
is has the creative aspects is probably a designer, learning experience designer or whatnot on the team. And there might be other people like learning consultants who are managing the intake process. But ultimately, I think it comes down, especially during this time, because of what's happened with COVID and how people are working more dispersed or remotely, or is alignment.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't have to work so hard to pass information from part or process to process. It should be seamless,
Yep.
and that's what I mean, right?
It's
So if you're
improving the handoff between the steps because it is.
yeah.
I mean, L&D is a process. That's the thing. You look at it, it is a supply chain in many regards, and where that input is coming from. What are we actually trying to solve? What are the intakes? Who's the audience? What is the overall problem? Handing that off to a design team to say, now let's create a solution for that. There's a lot of waste oftentimes in that handoff, and
Yeah,
also I mean, if somebody's watching and they're this person, let me know. But I don't know anybody who has ever said, what I really love doing is searching 100 different places to try and bring in all the feedback on the design of something to try and fix it. Right? That's
that's
not usually
exactly
something
it.
people are super excited about.
And we're only talking right now about newer requests, right? Like
Right?
what about inventory management? So if you're getting requests 3-4 years from now, like you want to be able to, at a click of a button or a quick search, be able to see anything that's ever had similar keywords, where you
Yeah.
can click into it, see who's worked on it, see what tasks were focused on, what content is linked to that, so that you can start reusing and repurposing stuff too, right?
Yeah.
Like if people leave, you should still be able, if somebody
You
leaves the
should have at least
company.
some insight into well, and what's interesting, I actually made a post about it this week, and it opened up a dialogue where, right, sometimes it's like, well, that stuff from 4 years ago it's irrelevant or it's garbage now. We wouldn't want to use it. We'd rather start from scratch. And my response to that is maybe you still would, but knowing it was there and having some insight into what it was or where it came from, so at least you can learn from what it was. And yeah, maybe you still end up starting from scratch, but at least you're making an informed decision on that versus assuming you need to start from scratch when maybe you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's bits and pieces that you'll be able to pull, right? So
Right. Even
there's
in
all
terms
the,
of knowing who the people were they worked with or what function. I mean, there's a lot of that stuff that, having that tribal knowledge, which that's, I think, one of the problems that you're talking about addressing is so often in our functions, all this stuff is tribal knowledge. It's based on, who knew what, who was involved in the project at the time, who was in the meeting that, was there. And now that's all gone if somebody leaves or just didn't communicate.
yeah. There you got it. So, I mean, we're talking about all the problems that come up in the front end
Yeah.
side of the learning development process. As you mentioned, it's like a supply chain. Um, Downstream, and I'm happy I actually
Yeah,
have a
pull it
slide
up.
on that.
You've got a visual that kind of highlights how this fits in.
Yeah, so
Here we go.
yeah, if you pull that up, so downstream, I mean, we have hundreds of vendors and tools for authoring and for learning management systems. They're
Yeah.
purpose built to solve the problem set. So what amazed us is that there is no purpose-built solutions to manage the supply chain part of
Yep.
learning development, right? So
Which
people
has
are,
dire consequences, by the way, right? When you when you make mistakes up here, the trickle down effect just continues to accelerate.
and that's why learning teams often say we have too many requests, not enough resources, but you need to also think about how do we optimize how we work, especially in this time of digital transformation, so that we are streamlined, we are able to measure capacity. And if you do this part properly, you don't need to have data analysts exporting spreadsheets from all these different areas trying to create these models that you can only run monthly. You can actually run real-time reports to see, like, measure supply and demand. Are we taking on too much? How do we reprioritize things that might be more important than things we're currently working on? And more importantly, how do we visually show these business cases to stakeholders to show them the value we're creating in the organization? And that comes from intake. If you have people saying, we need help here, but you structure it in a way like, what value will this create for the organization, and they fill it in, and then you prioritize that and you run it, you can actually go back to those business customers or business partners and build a business case on, like, what value we've created here, right?
Yeah.
There was one we were talking to with somebody about, one of our advisors, I think you've had him on your show, is Area 9 Learning,
Yeah.
Nikau, right?
Yep.
So he's on our advisory board, and I think he was telling me about a customer story about an airline company that needed to reduce the support tickets or something like that. So,
Okay.
being able to measure before and after, um, that's learning impact, right? So being and so if you tie all this data together, it doesn't need to be that hard. Like, you can spit out reports that do that for you, and then you can use that to build your business cases and also build your budget, your cases for budgets.
Yeah.
If you're able to show we have too many
Here's
requests.
the volume of stuff exactly.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
Then now you can sit down with a stakeholder and say, here's everything we're working on, here's everything that we're getting requested to work on. We can kick stuff back to the business partners, we can hire our vendors, but ultimately, we think we need more budget, and this is, if you give us
Here's
it,
the
this is
data to
what
support it.
exactly, right? So, and this is how
Well, I
we'll
think
impact the
what you're
organization.
talking about, right? It's one of these problems I've heard probably my entire career in the industry, right? We often talk about wanting to have a seat at the table. We want to be a strategic business partner, things like that, but we don't necessarily always act and operate in that manner, right? When you look at businesses and the way business makes decisions, it's around, well, what really, are the things we're setting out to do? What type of resources? How do we project? How do we forecast what that is so that we can do resource planning and budget planning around that versus kind of waiting until things hit us and then scramble to figure out, okay, well, what do we do? And then it can actually help us have a more business focused conversation and showcase, well, and here's what you're going to get for that. I need more budget or I need more resources because our current volume is this. These are the problems we're solving. We want to go 20% more than that next year. To do that, we're actually going to have to do this to quantify it.
Hmm. Exactly. But it's hard to get that data when you're working in silos in these different parts.
Yeah.
And really, this needs to be together. So when you bring it together, as you mentioned, like that's when the magic happens, right?
I
That's
took
what
that from your LinkedIn, right?
well,
That's your
that's why I
LinkedIn
talk about it.
tagline, like
That's why
making
I talk
magic
about it.
happen. So not
Yeah.
only are you like a WWE fighter, you're also a magician.
Do you know what's funny? I have an uncle, and his name's Steve Austin.
See, I wasn't that far off.
No. My dad actually looks like a wrestler. He's a like 6'1", like a big guy, like Ryan. I'm
Oh,
I'm a
funny.
short guy, so I don't know what happened to me. But
You got the stocky look though, so you could pull it off. You could pull it
yeah,
off. Anyway,
yeah,
we are way off target now. But so I mean, so here's the thing though. I'm curious as you interact with people on this. What we talked a little bit about how the tech has matured. I am curious what has matured a little bit about it that has now made this more feasible. So I'm going to pull this down and we'll, if there's some other slides we can talk, but I'm curious, like what, you've made some heavy investments into this. How has the tech really moved to help enable it?
yeah. So I think it stems back from when Trello first kind of
Okay.
came to fruition, right? With the concepts of Kanban boards and
Yep.
whatnot, and just looking at project management altogether in a much easier way. And
Okay.
then you had companies like Slack come out, and now Microsoft Teams, which is making an amazing impact in enterprise. But um, with collaboration and the concept of like,
Okay.
replacing email, like you shouldn't have to email back and forth
Yeah.
15 times to have a quick conversation, right? So I think a lot of enterprise SaaS applications have adopted these types of ideas and concepts, but tweak them in a way to solve specific problem sets.
Okay.
So you're starting to see software solutions that solve real problems for specific things, right? And Christy, our CMO, she always says, everybody, you don't buy software unless you're trying to save time and money. So
Right.
time and money shouldn't be the real value add. So what else does the software do, right? So in Synapse, it's about doubling capacity, doubling productivity of your team,
Okay.
taking all these administrative elements out of it and doing it in a way that's simple, similar to tools that you already use and love, but purpose built. And I can walk you through a couple slides if you're interested.
Yeah,
Just
well, and the other thing too, before we pull that up, well, actually, no, let's pull this up and let's talk about this a little bit because I think it is interesting that you bring this up because I have seen, and this was pre-COVID, but I think very recently the things you've hit on have exploded, right? This whole digital collaboration, how do we do this in this new world? The seamlessness of that and actually bringing project management and agility to life in some ways in a digital way versus the way it was done before. So I'm curious, what are we looking at?
Yeah, so this is just a planning board, for example, in Synapse. Everybody's familiar with Kanban boards. You see them a lot in a lot of applications. But again, purpose built, right? So in Synapse, when you have requests come in, they come into your board, and then that way you can move them and convert them into projects or whatnot. But
Okay.
when you flip open the cards, you can see that there's very relevant things to instructional design or to requests, and you can manage these things from in here as well. Bring in your team, right? But
Okay, so it's
then
designed around the L&D piece versus just, I mean, because yeah, you can do some of this stuff, but some of our needs are unique.
yeah, but this already helps to start solving the whole request submission, the whole inventory management challenges, the whole who's working on what, getting that visibility and alignment, and structuring it into whatever process you follow, whether it's SAM, ADDIE, these can be customized to your process so you can move it. Now, the request side is really interesting because we give free software to your business partners, to your requesters.
Okay.
So they can basically, and it's branded to them. We just have the logo here for the time being
So this is
for
this
this.
would be the actual like subject matter business partner experience that we're looking at now.
Yeah, so it works off of a deep link that's you can embed it anywhere. It works with single sign-on, etc., for a good user experience. But when they click on it, think of it in the flow of work. So sometimes we say, if you want everybody to fill out requests, which is not generally what happens, you can put in your LMS if you're trying to get people to come more to your LMS. You can put it in a Slack channel. You can put in your email signature. Or if it's specific business partners, just send them the link and tell them to bookmark it and say, when you have a request, click here. But it takes them to a request portal. and it's two-way. You can actually have two-way communications to do actual discovery. And
Okay,
it
so it's not
also,
just a one-way form that then's coming and feeding in.
exactly. And what's awesome about it is as L&D starts to move it in their queue and through, their stages, it notifies that business
Oh, so
partner.
they can actually follow the progress of their request.
You got it. So that way you have true transparency and visibility into the partnerships together, right? So that's kind of the request side. And then the content side is that whole, it's kind of like a TurboTax way of designing and storyboarding.
Okay.
Use templates to standardize workflows, and the workflows guide people to design content. But again, if you're worried about creativity, you can still have certain designers be able to upload their own stuff using a different tool so that you're not taking away that creativity, but you're still operationalizing,
I,
whatever.
I made it as an extremely difficult word to
Seriously.
say so that you would trip like that. So you're welcome.
Operationalizing, there we go, the processes, right? And so
Got it. So if they are doing some of this content gathering or they have their own storyboard tool that they prefer to use for that, the designer can actually pop that in there for the subject matter or business stakeholder. Look, it's not necessarily you have to use this for doing that, but use this to kind of bring it together.
yeah, so it depends how much you want to standardize, right?
Okay.
And that way it fits into your culture too. If you want to go further, which a lot of our clients do, then you can start storyboarding it like this. And what's cool is as you're adding and storyboarding assets, we're building this asset library in the background, right? So
Okay.
all these things become searchable and reusable. So
So it's almost to some degree almost populating an LCMS type capability where these assets are now usable for other things,
yeah,
correct?
very, very lightweight. It's just about, because it's just storyboarding, most people don't
Yeah.
actually go full to production, but you can at the same time, right?
Okay.
So, yeah, and then giving you reporting capabilities. Again, because this is all put together, you can start managing and seeing where all the intake comes in from specific time, places, and supply and demand. Like, are you over capacity or under capacity? So in the month of June, there's no more availability. So now you understand, okay, we have to make trade-offs. Where can we
Okay.
make trade-offs? Things like
So you
that.
can start seeing the trends because I mean we all see this, right? Different quarters, different months, depending on what's going on. You kind of know, like, hey, I'm just thinking as an example, right? Quarter close is coming. The business is super busy. They're not necessarily focused on this. So we know that's a dip, but that doesn't mean we should quick try and make things up because we know beginning of the quarter, it picks right back up. And if we do too much, we're actually going to be over capacity.
Exactly, and visualizing this in very simple way. L&D is already busy; things change daily, so you just need to get this stuff on the fly. And so this isn't meant to be a sales pitch for Synapse. It's just easier to
No.
show you visually how we recommend doing it and how we systemize it in the processes in one place. But we've seen some people try to make shift using different tools
Well, I
and
think
whatnot.
that's the point of the show, right? I mean, it's not a sales pitch, but the reality is this stuff, regardless of how you're pulling it off, is critical. And I do feel like it's a big gap in our industry because we are trying to cobble it together or worse, not doing anything with it, which is even more dangerous because then how do you know what you're working on and prioritization, all this other good stuff. So I think it is valuable to, right, figure this out regardless of what you end up doing. It's an important piece.
Yeah, it's just about really just figuring out how do you streamline these parts together. How do you empower your people to focus on more strategic elements that will provide the business value and less administrative tasks? And how do you get this all working together so it does become an engine, not to take away from anything creative or whatnot, but again,
No.
to just double, triple capacity by removing bottlenecks. And remember, you're already doing it with authoring. You're already doing it with your learning management systems or your out learning experience platforms. So it's just about figuring out how to do it on the front end, not
Yeah.
just the back end.
Well, and I think, one of the reasons that I thought this was such an important topic is a lot of times we get focused on the right because cleaning up your operations and your process, that's not like the fun whiz bang, right? Like stuff to talk about necessarily. That's not the pretty user experience kind of end design stuff that a lot of people like to focus their attention on. But the reality is, this is what we were talking about earlier, is the fact that the downstream effect of not doing this well can be catastrophic,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, it can be absolutely catastrophic to an L&D organization because like this is the kind of stuff that ends up resulting in massive impacts to resources, budget, things like that when you can't quantify, well, what are we working on? Why? What is the amount of time and effort that's going into this? What value are we getting out of that? If that's broken on the front end, you're just going to continue to break more pieces down the supply chain and end up with a broken product at the end. So I think that's where, sometimes it's easy to overlook because we're caught up with some of the other more fun kind of end stuff versus cleaning up the front.
Yeah, and think about by not having that visibility or alignment because you can't see into the process, you might not even know when it's broken and people are continuing to work, right? So
And work really hard, right? That's the other thing. You're putting a lot of time and energy into things, and you may not even realize you're working on something that's broken.
yeah, imagine being a designer creating content and then you think it's finished and you go to show it and like it's not truly aligned to the need, but you
Right.
didn't have full visibility into the need. It's there's broken telephone along the way. That's demotivating to that person. Like they probably did their job well and they're kind of throwing their hands up like,
Yeah.
well,
Well, there's
what
nothing
what I
worse than you've put all this effort, you've made this thing that you think is exactly on target, and then you bring it in front and it just gets, I've been there, it gets ripped to shreds, and you have no insight into why because you're operating off the information that you have.
yeah.
It's not a fun conversation to have.
No, and it's an important job. I mean, learning professionals, like we're seeing some amazing content from our clients being produced. We work with the National Firefighters Council, for example, and we've seen like content around like really important stuff for firefighters and emotional behaviors and things like that. And it's just really impactful. And then we see things that have are extreme that are being produced that are extremely helpful to companies during this time of COVID, et cetera, right? So this is important work and it's about empowering people so that you can just get it done the first time, get it right, remove the bottlenecks and be as efficient as you can. And that more important than anything is that they're not going to have burnout, right?
Yeah.
Like we're in a time right now, and this is a true statement. Every learning department I talk to is saying we have more work, and by the way, our budget in 2021 is extremely reduced,
Yep.
but the work expectations, they're like,
It's
how
up.
are we going to do
What are we going to
this?
do about it?
Yeah,
So it's actually driving us to, yeah. And I think efficiency is the only way we look at it. So on this one, I do a question from Brian again. I want to bring up
sure.
because I do want to talk about the fact that we've talked about the importance, and I think in general, when I've had these conversations, you get a lot of head nodding, right? Like, yeah, I agree, and yet so often it doesn't happen, right? We don't move from concept to action and saying, yes, let's operationalize this stuff, let's be more efficient, let's get on process. So two things, one question from Brian had to do with, right, on this intake process, asking people to fill in this content. What kind of content is it gathering along the way? And one question I have, and I'm curious your take on this, because I've had this before where I've operationalized it, and one of the challenges or pushbacks I'll get is, well, people don't want to fill things out. And my perspective is, if they can't take the time to fill something out, we're not going to take the time to leverage our resources to do something for it, right? There has to be some give and take along the way. But I am curious, to Brian's question, what does that intake look like? Is that customizable? What kind of things are you actually asking from people? And does it change along the way? Because what we need from people will evolve as you go.
Yeah, so I'm happy to share some links to some content. So we have an intake template
Okay.
that you can look at. We have an ebook on training intake best practices, and we also have um, a really interesting. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's basically a questionnaire you can fill out that tells you it's a rating system to tell you where you are on your intake journey. So happy to share those three things with Brian and or your audience.
Yes,
And
send me the links and any links you have. I'll put in the blog post so that people can actually take a look at this stuff.
yeah,
For people who are curious or like, I'd like to kind of see what this looks like or how does it actually, what's the experience like?
yeah, great. We can do that. We have a lot of toolkits about working with SMEs. Even getting in, investment for learning technology during this time. So there's a lot of cool stuff that we do that we think is helpful that we're
Okay.
happy to share. It's free resources. And yeah, so to
Brian's very
answer Brian's
excited about that.
question,
By the way, Brian is very happy with that one. So Brian, keep an eye out on the blog page. I'll put it there. But what are some of the things that, let's say somebody says, hey, all right, I get it. We need to move from talking about improving our process or efficiency. We need to do this. I've seen these things spin up and then burn out pretty quick. How do you see people who really lean into it and carry this forward? How do they actually kind of keep and maintain it? Although personally, it feels like once you start seeing it and you get used to it, you kind of don't go back. But I'm curious if you run into any of that.
yeah, I mean, always change is hard, right? So, and just to backstep to talk about real quick about the request, like people don't fill it out, right? I think it comes down to communication and transparency. If
Yeah,
somebody doesn't understand why they're filling it out,
good point.
right? So even on your form, if you say, look, we know nobody likes filling out forms, but by filling this out, it will kick off the process so that we can evaluate it, come back to you with questions. So together we can design the best solution possible to get this, which was that value statement, then more people are going to fill it out, right? So it's just about communication and alignment on that one. And then, what I would say about the other part is don't try and think too far ahead, piece by piece, right? There's a book that it's not a business book. It's kind of like this, I wouldn't even call it a spiritual book, but it's called The Power of Now.
Okay.
And long story short, like don't stress over things you can't control
Okay.
and
Yeah.
just look at what the next think of stairs, right? Just focus on that first step. And if you keep doing that,
Right.
you're
Stop
going to be
looking
at the
10
top.
steps up and being like, oh, how are we going to get to the 10th step?
Yeah.
One foot
So
in front of the other.
So the first part is that whole intake, right? So that you can better align to your customers, their needs, etc. So think about solving that part first. And then after that, it's going to naturally, it's like, okay, now we solve that. It's great. We have all these requests. So how do we manage them? So now you're getting into project prioritization naturally, and you have to figure out that part, right?
Yep.
And that will also tie into like team capacity because you want to think about your team, not overtake or say no at the same time to customers. So there's a balance and a way to think about solving that part of it, and then design. So there's different ways that you can solve these things. And again, we have a lot of content on this, but
Yeah.
my advice would be don't think about the 10 steps, think about each step, and before you know it, you would have climbed the whole staircase.
I think it's a really good point because I think you do see that, and not just with L&D intake process. You see this with a lot of things. We overwhelm ourselves with all of the things, so then we just don't ever start anywhere. Instead of saying, let's start putting one foot in front of the other, and then naturally, then you can take 2 steps, 3 steps. I think the other thing too, though, that is important, and I'm curious your take on this, is where I've seen this, it is a balancing act a little bit, right? You can't over index. Where I've seen it go cold is where when people start creating a process, it's a very cold, non collaborative process, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
it's here, fill out this form, it goes into a black hole, there's no communication, and so people are like, well, there's no value in filling out this form because I'm not feeling like that's there. Having an automated technology process that allows your platform, that allows you to have more efficiency, have more of this, it doesn't mean you don't talk to these people or you don't work with them, or you never, jump on Zoom and have a quick conversation with them. Like that doesn't
Exactly.
go away. You don't be like, well, now we have this form, fill out the form and I won't talk to you ever again.
Yeah,
And that's
exactly.
where I've seen it go south, as people just go way too far. And then, yeah, it is going to fail.
What I do internally, right? Because we have an office in Mexico, for example, and sometimes we have different holiday schedules, etc. So what I do is when an intake comes in, I'll schedule a Zoom meeting and we'll review it on Zoom using screen share and collaborate on the form. And then I'll just tag people using the common feature saying, okay, your takeaways are to do this, this, and this. I've tagged you on it. Like, have it done within 2 days type of thing. And then they have the reminder there, but we're not taking the human element out of it.
Yes.
I think that's important. This is a partnership. Requester and L&D, that's a partnership. So would you ever go to your partner and just try and eliminate the
Fill out this
communication?
web
We
form.
we all know where that will lead, right?
Yeah,
Hey,
yeah.
hey,
I
Annie,
don't think
just
that
fill
will
in
go
this
right. That
fill in
doesn't
this
go very
form.
well in L&D or anywhere else in life. So,
Yeah.
but I think that is an important clarification and an important point to make, because that's where it can go south, right? When you completely strip the human element out, of course you're going to piss off your stakeholders if they're used to talking to you and working through this, and now you just go, don't talk to me, fill out this form. That's not gonna go well.
They're also very smart people. They're going to see that you're keeping the human touch alive and you're optimizing efficiency, and that means that you're saving their time,
Yeah.
right? So
Well, and if anything, going back to what we talked about before with efficiency, is this allows you to spend more time on that higher order stuff,
mhm.
right? So instead of spending all this time chasing around emails and pulling this together, you can be spending that time having more impactful conversations with the people, getting clarity on it. Because, I mean, I have to imagine, I don't think I've ever seen a business stakeholder or a SME fully be able to perfectly articulate what the business need is on round one, right?
Mhm.
Like, here's this form. Oh, perfect. We have all the details we need. I don't need anything else. Maybe once Synapse is in operation, that happens, but I've yet to see where perfectly that
No,
execution
it's iterative. And that's the concept of agile learning, right?
right.
And it's not just on the intake process, it's during the project prioritization process. You might have prioritized a project. It's okay to change your mind to reprioritize something else that might have come up earlier, right? It's like managing a roadmap when building products. It's the same kind of concept. And so every single part should, along the process, should uh, en- enable or allow for iteration. And
Okay.
so that communication, collaboration, iteration is extremely important. That saves time, because
Yeah.
if you don't do that, you're waterfalling this whole thing. Taking a waterfall approach, you need to take this agile approach so you can make corrections along the way, because you learn too fast.
Yeah.
So if you're not iterating, you're not learning, you're not applying the learning in real time, and you're actually, by the time you realize that there's changes need to be made, you'll be almost done the project.
Far
Now you
down,
have to go
too
all
far
the
down
way back.
the line. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's again just creating massive inefficiency throughout. So one
Yeah,
question I have, because there's a fair amount of people that tune in and listen. How are organizations or independents? I'm just curious, how are they implementing this, right? And the reason I ask that is from a right. If you have a nice central L&D organization, it makes pretty clear sense in terms of how this would. But are you having, how are there organizations you're working with where maybe L&D is pretty fragmented? How do you manage that from a license standpoint?
yeah,
And I'm also curious, let's say you're independent or maybe you run a small business. Is this something that you can use? Is it possible to use that like outside of necessarily like one enterprise?
for sure. I mean, doubling capacity is doubling capacity. It doesn't matter if you're one person or 10 people.
Okay.
The licensing is the same for one user versus larger organizations. We price similar to an authoring tool, right?
Okay.
So except requesters get free software, and content contributors are also free, and collaborators and projects are free. So, think of the SMEs who just pop in and out or whatnot. So people who are active users are using this to manage their work. That's how we charge, and it's not very expensive. It's about $1,500 for the year.
Okay.
In flexible payments, etc. So, but the use cases we're seeing are incredible. So the strong ROI metrics. But that so any size team, efficiency gain, one person versus 10, that is kind of irrelevant. And then from a centralized to decentralized, it's flexible because it's per user. You can have different instance of Synapse for the different teams, or you can have
Okay.
different boards for different teams. So all the core data in the backend is still being centralized while people are working decentralized.
Okay. Got it. Well, because I'm just thinking in large, big global organizations where you may have tons of teams all over the place doing different things, you have the flexibility to say, well, is there a big enough justification to have a separate instance? Or could we all be on one instance so we have greater visibility? Because I can tell you just from my personal experience, that's where things can get really messy, where it's like, well, we've got L&D people all over kind of solving the same problems, but we have no visibility into it. So we may actually be trying to solve the same problem 8 times with 8 different groups of people doing it, and we just don't even know what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, and again, it's about taking the step-by-step approach.
Not
And
trying to eat the whole elephant in step
yeah,
one.
we'll map that out with clients. We have a client success team that does something that's great is clients of ours never have to train their users. We do that for them. It's built into that pricing.
Okay.
And there's live chat support built into the application. So at any time you can connect with your extended member of the team, which is the client success person who we assign to work with you, and they'll do scrums. They'll help you come up with the implementation plan. They'll help you implement. They'll train the people. It's pretty cool stuff. So we're seeing really this doesn't have to be as hard as one might think. It's
Yeah. I think
and
sometimes the idea of it is harder than the actual action of it. I think it's easy to get wrapped up in all of that. And again, like we said, you end up in analysis paralysis because you start overthinking, well, what about this? What about this? Versus just saying, why don't you just take the first step and then move
yeah,
forward?
just start with intake, do that for a few months, get people used to it, and then you say, oh, now we're going to start managing the projects here. You start inviting them in, they start coming in, seeing how easy it is, and then you start designing the content. Before you know it, you've digitized that process, right? So yeah, step by step, not getting analysis paralysis, not freaking out over it, and you'll notice the performance gains immediately on the areas that you're starting to transform.
Okay. Awesome. Well, it's been fantastic. And I really appreciate, it was a while ago when we first chatted about getting you on the show. So I'm glad we've actually finally the day has come and we've been able to talk about it because I think it is an extremely important topic. And now of all times, probably at an all-time high of importance in terms of being able to, I hate the phrase do more with less, but it's about gaining efficiency so that you're able to optimize your effort. It's not about just cramming more things through the funnel. It's about saying, let's strip out the waste so that we can use our energy on the best activities. So
Exactly.
this has been awesome, Ryan, and I appreciate you taking the time. Everybody's very excited about the resource center, so I will make sure to include that and look forward to continuing the conversation to hear how you continue helping organizations with this and how the product evolves. Because I'm sure you've been on this journey for a bit and continue to learn more about how to optimize it.
Yeah, learn every day, and excited about it. We have a responsibility now, so it's and we'd love to innovate with everybody in the industry to really solve this properly.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday. Thanks everybody who's been tuning in. Hopefully we got your questions answered. If you have any other ones, post them in the comments and I'll tag Ryan and we'll kind of try and answer any of those. But have a fantastic rest of your Friday and a wonderful weekend. Bye everybody.